In this video, we'll take a look at the render quality settings that we'll find in the render settings window. Depending on the render, the quality settings will be slightly different. We'll be staying with the Maya software, so we'll click on its tab. We've taken a look, we've set all the common attributes for the image size and the image format and all our animated frames in and out. This is the animation we've set so far. And in the render settings, we'll switch to the Maya software. Now, this is set to production quality rendering already, which gives us a result that is pretty pleasing. I'm going to go ahead and purge my images. I'll go ahead and put this into our buffer. We're at 640 by 360, which is half of 720 HD resolution. Gives us a 16 by 9 image format, which is the newfangled flat screen TVs. That's the aspect ratio that they enjoy. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the quality presets, and I'm going to go into the preview quality, and it turns a lot of these quality settings down in the render settings. This is a pretty fast render. It took about 2 seconds. So the preview render is going to be much faster. It's about half the time. You'll notice much better savings when you lower your quality settings, especially with big and heavy scenes. You'll want to preview your renders before you get to the higher quality. The quality settings essentially introduce some artifacting, especially around the edges of the objects, and this is called aliasing. This creates jagged lines where there's a diagonal or a curve. If I toggle between the higher quality rendering and the lower quality rendering, you'll see that the higher quality rendering has smoothed those aliased areas, and that is called anti-aliasing. These settings are in the render settings window. You can go ahead and choose from the presets under quality, or you can create your own quite easily. Let's go ahead and go to the production quality, and you'll see a number of things have turned on for us. Our shading are the number of samples that we get for aliasing. The lower the samples, let's go ahead and lower all these way down to 1. And let's render our scene, and you'll start noticing a little bit of jagged edges. Turn the multi-pixel off as well, and you'll notice that those jagged edges become a little bit worse. These are controlled by the number of shading samples that you use, the minimum and the maximum. What it does is it takes a look at the difference. Let's go ahead. I'm going to use the Alt right mouse button key to kind of zoom in to my render view, and the Alt and middle mouse button to pan my view. Basically, what the renderer does is it takes a look at the pixels and what color they are. When pixels are adjacent to each other, there's a threshold of a difference between the color of one pixel compared to the color of the pixel right next to it. And that is called a contrast threshold. The higher quality of your renders, the more sampling and the better your threshold is, meaning it will sample and will take a look at the difference between 2 pixels adjacent to each other, and it will try to smooth the colors and create a better render, a better edge. If we go to contrast sensitive, you'll see that the contrast numbers have gone down. The lower these numbers, the more sampling will happen in these areas, pushing up to a higher sampling rate. If we turn the max sampling up to a much more ridiculous number, we'll run into much higher render times for a better result. As you can see, when I'm zoomed in, we go and see a little bit in the shadow here between our ridiculous sample and our previous, which was set to production quality, which had a max sample of 8. So the difference is a little bit negligible, but we incurred an extra second of render time. You want to be careful with your render settings, and you want to find the right minimum shading and maximum shading numbers in comparison to the contrast threshold to find your best bang for the buck. So you're not necessarily rendering lots and lots of samples for no reason. Now I'm going to force everything to sample at 20 times, and that's going to be a bit longer of a render. And again, the net result will be negligible between the two. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our camera move. Let's go to frame 45, and between 45 and 50, let's create a very sudden camera jerk all the way to the left here. Let's select our camera, and in the channel box we can right click, key selected for the translate and rotate. Now we have a move and then a sudden jerk over. Why I did this is to show you how to render with motion blur. Right now, let's go ahead and go back to production quality and run a quick render of this, and we'll see our render. We'll put that in the buffer. Now what we'll do is go ahead and go into our motion blur options and turn on motion blur. We'll leave blur by frame at 1, and we'll go ahead and hit render, and we'll see motion blur for that violent camera move. You'll start noticing bits of artifacting and a little bit of noise in the render because the smoothness has to be a lot better when you've enabled motion blur. Increasing the blur by frame will increase the amount of blur that we see. Let's set that to 2 and compare a blur by frame 1 render and a blur by frame 2 render. And you'll see a much more blurry and a much slower render than we had with a blur by frame 1. We have a much bigger blur, we have much more noise in there. Let's go back to 1, and let's try to mitigate some of the noise that we've been seeing here. And we can do that by increasing the shading that we see. Let's go ahead and turn our max shading up to 12. We'll turn our contrast down a little bit. Let's go to 0.3, 0.2, and 0.45. And that'll increase the amount of attention paid to these areas. Go ahead and hit render, and we'll take a look at the comparison between these two. And we'll notice that it is a slower render, and the quality has ever so slightly gotten better. You'll want to up your shading samples a little bit more to get much smoother. You can also increase your minimum samples to force more, and you can also bring down your contrast threshold to force the renderer to pay attention to the max shading samples more. Now I'm only going to render this part for the sake of time, and we'll see that going off in much better detail than we had before by forcing more samples in these areas. In this video, we took a look at quality settings in the render settings window, namely the shading samples and the contrast threshold, and we also learned how to enable motion blur and to compensate for the noise that's created by motion blur.